Watch out. Here we are then at the Bronx Zoo. And here we are on the SS America. The Bronx Zoo was just a side trip because we're taking a trip to England and by ship. A view from the docks of beautiful New York City. Sarah, Hugh, Tim, and Mother taking their still photograph before we set out. Everybody dressed in their finest for this festive occasion. It was just a regular ship, it wasn't a cruise. Now here's the New York tug, quite a big vessel on the Hudson River. And here's the traditional streamers as the liner sets sail. They're taking down the gangplanks now. That's the rail of the ship. People on the shore waving us goodbye. And people on the ship similarly waving. You can see the gangways there. There's the Empire State Building overlooking us all as we pull out of our slip by that tug. We passed the Staten Island ferry, which is just marking time. Did I just go past? Because to heck with the rules of the sea, we're bigger than they are. Anyway, we are here at sea, well at sea, as you can see. Here's the massive prow of the SS America, a beautiful ship, which, as I speak, in 1993, is sitting in Newport News, waiting a disposition on her future. But the voyage was in 1962, quite a while ago, and she was in her prime when transatlantic liners were in their prime. Well, not exactly in their prime, they were just slightly past it, but because air traffic was beginning to come about, and that knocked them out of the running somewhat, I guess. But it was a very beautiful voyage. The most memorable thing about the SS America, I think, was the staff on board. It was typical American courtesy and bonhomie. And we remember our restaurant waiter, with whom we got very friendly. Here's Hugh and Sarah with a friend they found on board. And here's our wake, by which I mean the white flow of water in the ocean as we pass through it, with music by Bath, by the way, the Cornish Rhapsody, you'll recognize, very beautiful, made for the movies. There's Joe sitting in the fairly cold but sunlight anyway, and here's looking through our porthole on the ship, and we had a very nice cabin. Joe sitting at the table writing letters to, presumably to people in Canada, I would think. And again, the bathroom cabinets and the porthole. We got a little bit of hell from the staff for leaving the porthole open in the storm. It got a little bit wet inside the cabin, but not too bad. It was dark. Here's sunset. A little beautiful at sea. Funnel, single funnel on the bridge of the SS America. A little misty weather and a man up in the prow on lookout to make sure that we don't hit anything we don't want. Now here we are in Dunleary, the port, of course, for Dublin itself. So we've reached the other side, and here's the harbour for Dunleary, and the tender backing away from the ship, having taken visitors to Ireland on board and on their way to taking them to shore. And now that's a French tug, as I ever saw one, and here we are backing out of Le Havre, which will be our last stop before we got to Southampton. We're coming down the very beautiful French coast, and I always like to think that's Cap Gris-Nez, but I'm not really sure of that. But it kind of looks like it. And on the way from France to Southampton, the children are getting understandably excited, especially seeing sights like Queen Elizabeth. That's the first Queen Elizabeth ship, a very magnificent, massive ship. The forerunner, of course, of Queen Elizabeth II. And here we are in Southampton harbour itself, going towards the dock, towed by a somewhat more diminutive English tug, but capable of the job, I'm sure, more than. And on the shore, the second from the left and third from the left is Phil and Harold waving us. We and the children get our first sight of the English railway there with the little trucks, four-wheel trucks. It's the bridge of the America. We're rather sorry to see her say goodbye to her American crew. And here's a more traditional docking that I always look for, is the throwing of the rope. I presume he made it the first time. Here we are at sightseeing in London. Here's St Paul's and St Paul's railway station, London taxi, and a couple of rather strange vehicles with three-wheeled tractors that I was very familiar with as a child. Just about to pass. There's one, and here's another one. The tractors are three-wheeled, and they belong to the railway company. And here's an old familiar number 8 bus. I used to go to school on that bus, but not on this east end of the travel, but rather on the west end, where it started out about 10 miles away for about a 2-mile journey. Here again is Westminster, St Paul's Cathedral, designed by Sir Christopher Wren in 1666, the year after the Great Fire. There's the London Bobby in Ludgate Circus doing his traffic duty. You don't see that so much these days. I guess there's more traffic lights around. And there was some bomb damage there, you may have noticed, in that thing just behind the station, the grey wall. But guess where this is? Of course, you had to go to Buckingham Palace and see the beautiful horse guards as they're coming up the mall towards the palace. They're cut around the front of the palace and go down the other side into their mews, into their barracks and horse stables. Their mews is not a poetic mews, of course. It's one where horses are sort of kept. There's the family coming down the steps of the Albert Memorial in front of the palace, trying to get a better view. The crowd's very well behaved and they make room for children. Now here's the new guard coming along to take part in the changing of the guard. Here's the old guard waiting to receive them, presenting arms, order arms. Now these guys here are the new guard. You can see it's rather dark, but they're coming in on the Kensington side of the palace. And here they are doing a ceremonial slow march. It's rather difficult to do and keep straight, and they're not as good as we used to do it in the Royal Air Force, even. Nah, it ain't bad. Their boots, retiring of the colours. Their traditional red tunics are underneath their grey tunics. Now here's somebody doing sentry duty at the end of the changeover. One of the sergeants looks after their socks, says Alice. Do you think the king knows all about me? He's sure to, dear, but it's time for tea. Here we are now, just going past the festival hall. I had to point that out. Beautiful concert hall. Joe and I have been shooting the Waterloo Bridge. We took the children on a trip down the river after going to St Paul's, and there was St Paul's again. There's Shelmake's house looking back at the Waterloo Bridge. Here's the beautiful Blackfriars Bridge, painted blue. Never could understand that, but I guess it looks better than if it was painted black. Blackfriars. Here are warehouses and their offices over near Smithfield Meat Market, coming down to the river. The barges being towed by a not too typical looking tug, I must say. There is the Tower Bridge in the distance from our river bus, and there's the beautiful 1066 Tower of London. Now, those last shots were taken east of the Tower of London that we'd shot, and we've come back now. Here it is open, a very rare sight indeed as far as I'm concerned, for somebody who doesn't see it that often. But I was unable to take it just cracking and opening because I, of course, had to change the film and the camera. That's another typical thing that besets people. Here we are at the foot of the of Big Ben. Just a couple of years ago, Joe and I finally got and looked in on the visitors gallery of the House of Commons and the House of Lords. It's very interesting, highly recommended. Here we are on our way down to Devonshire, and here is a whole-class locomotive in Exeter station backing up to our train, which had split in Exeter. There's the buffers just touching, and young Hugh getting ideas, no doubt. Valve cover for Great Western engines. We're almost coupled up. There's a view of the furnace, and here we are pulling out of the station. And here we come around the corner into sight of the River Dart, coming down the Kingswear side of the river. This is a familiar walk to Joe and myself. We often walk down, went up on the higher ferry, walk down the side of the river. Here we are now, and see the trains passing by, and then go back on the lower ferry. Of course, this branch of the railroad has stopped now, but it is run by amateurs, or, you know, whatever they call this. But it was, at the time of these photographs, it was about 1962, and the official railroad, British Railways, was still operating. And here's the station arriving, and here's the train arriving at Kingswear Station. Just pulling in. And finally arriving at the buffer stops. There are no prizes awarded for telling me why the steam is being sucked into this engine rather than being blown out of it. Looking across the river to the town of Dartmouth itself. Young Timothy, we're on the boat float now, waiting for the ferry, and apparently we're on the ferry and going across the river. Looking up the river, and now looking at the town of Dartmouth. Just about in that shot somewhere is where Uncle Reg lives right now. Now here's looking out to the castle, out to the estuary. Now we're looking at the castle, the view from the top of Derriton, where Jo lived when I met her. At 10 Mount Boone. Here again is the view from 10 Mount Boone. With the church in the middle of the town. That's not the church we were married at. The church we married at was older than this one. It was up at the top of the town. That's the mayor's house, right about in the middle of the scene right now with the two tall chimneys. I know where that mayor's house is because Toto the dog led me there one day, but that's another story. Here's the higher ferry, a paddle steamer with well, it was a steamer with a little steam donkey engine that worked it, and it's guided by disused mine cables from Cornwall. Here are cars of the era and Tim. There's the Dartmouth Naval College, which is the Annapolis of England. The Castle Hotel, which is overlooking the boat float. The boat float is a sort of centerpiece of the nautical life of the town, where where people keep their smaller boats. They have to be small in order to get through that little tunnel there. That's the only access for boats to the boat float. A whole load of swans, somewhat more than there were. Now here is Joe and Timothy. Of course, Hugh and Sarah were at school at this time. They went off to school in Dartmouth, where they learned to read. Now here's a couple of my very favorite people. There's Jack Denning and his wife Betty. Jack is still in good health. He's in his 70s now, and he looks just about the same as ever. He runs a gas station at the top of the town. But Betty, unfortunately, has had a stroke. But she's still able to communicate pretty well and walk around. It's not as active as she was. And Jack is as generous as ever. Always, when we were in town, took us out on a fishing trip out to sea, either in a rented boat or in his own boat, which we might see later on. So here we are, off. Now, we looked up there. There's our old friend Kathy. It's Joe's friend. She was a colleague at the pottery, and we went on a trip to the town of Brent, which is on the edge of the moors, and you get to it through Kingsbridge on a branch line. Well, here's the main line railway from Plymouth to London, and here's now, instead of a beautiful Castle class locomotive, here's a, I think, somewhat beautiful diesel loco starting out. Kathy and Bob Langford have exchanged postcards with us, or Christmas cards with us, for all these years. They live in the dear little village of Blackhorton in Devonshire. Now here's the branch line. We're going home now, or correction, well, back to Kingsbridge. The branch line is now no longer in existence due to a certain Dr. Beecham in England, who was somewhat ill repute for tearing up, having the branch lines torn up. Here we are on one of the beaches in Devonshire, which is familiar to Joe, but I'm not quite sure of the name. But here's Timothy enjoying the sand dunes very much. And there's the Valiant, which we took with us. Excellent transport. Warning: if you bathe on the south side of the sand bay, i.e. the side to your left, looking towards the sea, you will probably be drowned. But a fat lot old Tim cares about that. He's not going to bathe in that cold water anyway. He's a lad who's been to Florida and doesn't. Here's Kathy and watching Joe writing postcards. Here's the Valiant on its way down through the road past what used to be the Coast Guard's lookout over, again, the estuary of the Dart. Here's the Dart from an upper side view, the Dart estuary. The Mewstone in the distance there. And the family, Joe and the 3 children, Hugh, Sarah and Tim, walking down the pathway to Sugary Cove and beyond. Some beautiful coves just down around the headland from the castle, which you gain access by this pathway along the cliff. Here we are driving down into the village of, I want to say Slapton, but it's not Slapton. It's, yeah. It's where Kath and Reg lived until very recently. Stoke Fleming, of course. You all recognise it, I know, down the main drag here. And the road takes a sharp left at this point, and here we are up the lip, and then you went over the brow of the hill, and then down the hill again to the beginnings of Blackpool Sands. But we struck off into the hinterland of Devonshire, and here we are going down some of the back country lanes in the Valiant, which somewhat filled it up, small car though it is. Typical old stone-walled farms. Into now the village of Slapton, behind Slapton Sands, which we'll see a little later. And on the road back to Dartmouth, and here we are approaching Blackpool Sands once more. And with any luck, we should see, there it is. It's quite a beautiful Blackpool Bay. The beach is not soft sandy, however, it's sort of fine pebbles. And has in back of it this beautiful little thatch roof village of Venn, V-E-N, which is the end of the Venn Road. And here is Timothy and myself and Phyllis, Joe's mother, Phyllis Moore, and the Valiant in the background, the signpost to Dartmouth, and Blackpool in the other direction. Here we are looking on the high road over Dartmouth, looking down the valley. The river runs somewhat horizontal across the picture. And there we are at the end of that particular sequence. There's more to come.